Imagine a doorway cut into a stucco wall the color of old butter, tall enough for a man on horseback to ride straight through without ducking his head. Beyond it, hidden from the street entirely, a courtyard drips with banana leaves and cistern water, and somewhere above, iron lace casts shadows across a gallery railing warmed by the Gulf sun. This is New Orleans in 1850, and the doorway you just imagined is a porte cochere, the carriage entrance of a Creole townhouse, and it's about to become the way into one of the strangest, richest, most misunderstood chapters in American city life. By the middle of the 19th century, New Orleans wasn't just a southern city. It was one of the busiest ports on the entire planet, ranked fourth in the world behind only London, Liverpool, and New York, and it was, without much competition, the largest city in the American South. Bales of cotton and hogsheads of sugar rolled down the levee day and night, loaded onto steamboats and ocean-going ships bound for Liverpool, Le Havre, and New York Harbor. More than half of all the cotton leaving the United States passed through this single port. The money that flowed in from that trade built the very houses we're about to step into, and it also built a population unlike anywhere else in America. French Creole families whose roots ran back generations mixed daily with Spanish administrators' descendants, Anglo-American merchants pouring in from the East Coast, German and Irish immigrants working the docks, free people of African and mixed-race descent who owned property and businesses, and Choctaw traders who still came into the city to sell herbs, filet powder, and baskets at the market. Nowhere else in the country did this many worlds share the same sidewalk, and the city, physically, reflected that division. If you stood on Canal Street in 1850, you were standing on what locals literally called the neutral ground, a wide median that still carries that name today. On one side sat the Vieux Carré, the old French quarter, with its Creole families, its Catholic churches, its language still thick with French and Spanish influence. On the other side, upriver, a newer American district was rising fast, built by Anglo-American arrivals who wanted their own churches, their own architecture, their own English-speaking banks. The two sides eyed each other with a mix of rivalry and grudging economic partnership, and Canal Street was the line where those two versions of New Orleans quite literally met and mixed. Now let's go back to that doorway, because the Creole townhouse itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how people lived in this city. These homes were built from brick, then coated in painted stucco to seal out the brutal humidity, topped with steep slate roofs designed to shed the region's violent afternoon rainstorms. Wrapped around the upper floors, cast iron galleries stretched out over the sidewalk, some plain, some worked into elaborate patterns of vines, oak leaves, or morning glories, cast in foundries just outside the city and bolted on like jewelry. But the real secret of these houses wasn't visible from the street at all. Nearly every townhouse funneled visitors, carriages, and family alike through that same wide arched carriage entrance, the porte cochere, which cut straight through the ground floor of the building and opened into a private courtyard hidden from public view. From the street, a stranger saw only a stately, closed facade. Behind it, the household's real life unfolded, shielded from the noise, dust, and heat of the city outside. Step inside the main house itself, and the layout feels almost architectural sleight of hand. Rooms didn't branch off a central hallway the way American homes typically did. Instead, they opened directly into one another in a sequence called enfilade, room after room in a straight line, with tall doorways lined up so that a breeze entering the front of the house could travel clean through to the back. Ceilings soared 12 to 14 feet high, not for grandeur alone but for survival. Heat rises, and in a city where summer temperatures sat thick and wet for months at a time, those extra feet of airspace gave families somewhere for the hottest air to go, up and away from where people actually lived and slept. Tall French doors, sometimes reaching floor to ceiling, opened onto the galleries to catch whatever breath of wind came off the river. Inside, mahogany armoires stood in for closets, since built-in storage was rare, and by 1850 many wealthier homes had begun installing gasoliers, elegant fixtures fed by piped gas lines that were just beginning to snake beneath the streets of the city, casting a warm, steady light that oil lamps and candles never quite matched. Walk back through that carriage passage, out into the courtyard, and you've found the true engine room of the household. This wasn't decorative garden space, not primarily anyway. It was where daily survival happened. Cisterns, tall wooden or brick tanks, collected rainwater off the roof for drinking, cooking, and washing, since the Mississippi's water was too muddy and the city's groundwater too brackish to rely on. Some properties supplemented those cisterns with wells. And tucked against the rear of the courtyard, usually 2 stories tall and built separately from the main house, stood the service wing. This is where the kitchen lived, deliberately detached from the family's living quarters. That separation wasn't a matter of taste. It was fire safety and heat management rolled into one practical decision. Open hearths and wood-fired ovens posed a constant fire risk in a city built largely of wood and plaster, and keeping that heat, along with the smoke, grease, and noise of cooking, away from the main house meant a more livable home for everyone upstairs. The upper floor of that same service wing often held sleeping quarters for the household's enslaved domestic workers, placing them in close daily proximity to the family they served while remaining spatially separate from the family's private rooms. And that brings us to the people who actually filled these houses and made them run. A prosperous Creole townhouse in 1850 typically sheltered a merchant family at its center, people whose income came from the cotton and sugar trade, from importing goods, from law or banking or shipping. But that family rarely ran the household alone. Enslaved domestic workers handled cooking, cleaning, childcare, and the constant physical labor a house like this demanded, their lives entirely bound to the family's will under the brutal reality of American slavery. Alongside them, it wasn't unusual to find free women of color hired for specific domestic roles, paid workers navigating a social position that existed somewhere between the plantation economy of the broader South and the more fluid, complicated racial landscape unique to New Orleans. That complexity brings us to one of the most remarkable and often overlooked communities in pre-Civil War America, the gens de couleur libres, the free people of color. New Orleans was home to one of the largest and most economically successful free black populations anywhere in North America at the time. Many built lives as skilled artisans, cabinet makers, tailors, cigar makers, and masons. Others became property owners, landlords, and even published writers and poets, participating in a literary and intellectual culture that had few parallels among free black communities elsewhere in the country. Free women of color, in particular, carved out a distinct visual identity within the city. Louisiana law at one point required women of color to cover their hair in a plain headwrap called a tignon, an attempt to visually mark and diminish their social status. Instead of accepting that erasure, these women turned the tignon into art, wrapping it in elaborate folds, pinning it with jewels and brooches, and turning a garment meant to suppress them into one of the most striking fashion statements in the city. It's a small detail, a piece of cloth and a pin, but it tells you everything about the resilience and creativity running through this particular corner of American history. Step back out onto the street at dusk, and the rhythm of the household shifts into its evening pattern. Meals in a Creole home followed a schedule borrowed loosely from French tradition, a lighter breakfast, a substantial midday dinner, and a later, more social supper. And the food itself, even by 1850, was already unmistakably its own cuisine, distinct from anything else in the country. Gumbo simmered for hours, thickened with okra or filet powder depending on who was cooking and what was in season. Jambalaya packed rice with whatever meat, sausage, or seafood the market offered that week. Red beans and rice, traditionally simmered low and slow on Mondays, using the ham bone left over from Sunday's dinner. Courbouillon brought fish and tomatoes together in a spiced, tangy broth. Calas, sweet rice fritters, were sold hot on street corners, often by free women of color balancing trays on their heads and calling out to passers-by. And pralines, that rich mix of sugar, butter, and pecans, cooled on wax paper in shop windows near the French market. That market itself, running along the riverfront, supplied households fresh daily, a chaotic, fragrant sprawl of vendors selling produce, seafood pulled straight from the Gulf, spices, and baked goods, the true pantry of the entire city. Once the day's business wound down, New Orleans didn't quiet, it transformed. The port itself never really slept. Steamboats loaded and unloaded around the clock along the levee, their whistles cutting through the humid night air, while ocean-going ships waited their turn to carry cotton and sugar out toward Atlantic markets. But for the city's wealthier residents, evening meant something else entirely: culture. The Théâtre d'Orléans staged opera performances that rivaled anything in New York or Philadelphia, drawing audiences dressed in their finest despite the oppressive heat. Other theaters offered drama and comedy in both French and English. And private homes hosted soirees, evening gatherings filled with music, conversation, and the kind of social maneuvering that mattered enormously in a city built on trade relationships and family alliances. But every summer, that glittering social calendar ran alongside a darker, quieter threat. Yellow fever and cholera swept through New Orleans with grim regularity, feeding on the same humid climate, stagnant water, and crowded conditions that made the city so prosperous in the first place. Those same cisterns collecting rainwater in every courtyard, so essential to daily life, also served as breeding grounds for the mosquitoes carrying yellow fever, though no one in 1850 yet understood that connection. Wealthy families who could afford it often left the city entirely during the worst months, fleeing to the countryside or up the coast, while those who stayed behind lived with a fear as constant and familiar as the summer heat itself. It's a sobering thread running underneath all that wealth and culture, a reminder that even the most beautiful courtyard, with its iron lace and gaslight and simmering gumbo, existed inside a city gambling constantly with disease, fire, and the human cost of the labor system holding much of it up. Stand back out on the street one more time, and look at the whole picture together. A carriage entrance built wide enough for horses, leading into a courtyard built for water and fire safety and shaded labor. A house built tall and open to fight the heat, filled with mahogany and gaslight and the murmur of French and English mixed together. A kitchen deliberately kept apart, staffed by people whose lives were bound to that household in profoundly different ways, from enslaved workers with no legal freedom to skilled free artisans building fortunes of their own just blocks away. A city eating gumbo and calas while ships loaded with cotton pushed out toward the Gulf, and opera drifted out of open windows while fever crept through the same humid air. That's the Creole townhouse in 1850s New Orleans, not just a style of architecture, but a physical blueprint of an entire society trying to manage heat, danger, wealth, and human complexity, all within 4 stucco walls and 1 wide, shadowed doorway.